Hello and welcome to this session 4 of MarSec21, where we'll be looking at the legal, consulting and technical challenges of maritime cybersecurity. We're extremely fortunate today to have with us Julian Clark, the global senior partner at international law firm Ince, who is widely recognized as a leader in the fields of shipping and international trade, and also as an expert in cybercrime and cybersecurity. We'll also be hearing from Rick Tiene, who is the Vice President of Smart Cities at Mission Secure. He's one of the leading advocates of greater security of OT systems as they become more integrated with IT systems. So right now, I'll hand you over to Julian and Rick.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everybody for tuning in to this presentation. Over the next 15 minutes or so, myself and Rick are going to speak about maritime cybersecurity from the legal, consulting and the technical side, and then we'll go back to Simon for some Q&A. So we want to cover three main topics over the next 15 minutes, looking at cyber solutions and the fact that the threat is real, looking at cyber solutions and the threat yet to come, and then looking at operational technology and asking this question, has cyber risk found a back door? Now, I'd like to actually start this presentation with, and you can see now on the screen, a picture of a quite scary bear. You might think that's a little bit odd, but hopefully the reason for that will become apparent. I'll tell you a story. There's two walkers on a trek together, and suddenly coming out of the forest appears the biggest bear either of them have ever seen. And this bear has quite clearly not had a good day. This is one angry and hungry looking bear, if bears can look angry and hungry, but the chap on the screen now doesn't look particularly friendly. Now, the immediate reaction of one of the two friends is to stop, put his backpack on the ground and extract from that this really great pair of running shoes and start to lace them up. And his friend turns to him and says, "What the hell are you doing? You're never going to be able to outrun that bear." Let me come back to the answer to that question a little later in this presentation. So let's look at this issue of whether or not the issue of cyber security, whether the threat is real. Well, Rick and I have described this as the Titanic disaster scenario. And the reason that we do that is this analogy to an iceberg, as you can see on the screen now. What we hear about and what we see are the identified incidents. Things like Maersk getting caught up in the NotPetya attack. But that very much is the tip of the iceberg. And what is far more scary and far more worrying is what's lying beneath the waterline. And that's the unidentified incidents, the failed attempts, and indeed future risk. And we only need to look at some statistics to confirm that Titanic disaster scenario. A 400% increase in attempted cyber attacks targeting the maritime sector alone since February 2020. And then attacks on operational technology increasing by 900% over the last 3 years. And in a worst case study where 15 Asian ports were targeted with a cyber attack, an overall claim of in excess of 110 billion US dollars. And all of this is in a context where there's a lacuna in relation to the availability of insurance and coverage. Some 92% of estimated costs arising from a cyber attack remaining uninsured. And that's despite there being some innovative new products on the market. And when you consider that over the last decade, US government has incurred costs of 130 billion in relation to cybersecurity, and last year alone, 17 billion in relation to dealing with cyber activities. And you see the kind of threat that we're dealing with. And of course, now we also have regulation in form of the IMO's requirement that from the next annual verification of a vessel's document of compliance, all shipping companies will be mandated to ensure that cybersecurity risks are appropriately addressed in existing safety management systems. And people are already commenting that the IMO guidelines are out of date. And shipping in many ways is far less ready for IMO compliance and cyber compliance than it was when it had to deal in Europe with the issues of the introduction of GDPR. So if that's the position now, what about the threat yet to come? Well, the fact is we simply are just not as ahead of the curve in the maritime sector as we are, say, in other sectors such as aviation. Kronos Kapelides, who's a leading commentator on cyber risk, has said this: when we talk about cybersecurity, it is not a matter of if you will be attacked, but when. And there are lots of incidences of how we've seen cyber intrusion impact on other areas of maritime. During the Gulf of Aden piracy crisis, one of the Greek ship owners that were targeted on a number of occasions subsequently found out that pirates had hired hackers to infiltrate their systems so that the pirates could target the most valuable assets. We also saw examples of citadel breach as a result of cyber intrusion to identify the weak spots and construction of citadels. So what can a hacker do, and how long does it take a hacker to infiltrate a vessel system? Well, let me hand over to Rick to say something about that.
Thank you, Julian. In our work, we do quite a bit of ethical hacking, and I can certainly give examples of all sorts of platforms that we've had quite easy success in demonstrating vulnerabilities, including maritime vessels, both in our work on assessments and some other projects that we've done. I'll talk about a specific one a little later. But when we talk about the speed at which this can happen, but actually we don't need to talk as much about ethical incidents, ethical hacking incidents as real world incidents these days. There are more and more examples that we're seeing here in the States right now. We're still, right where I live, going through an issue of a real or perceived, really is probably the better way to put it, gas shortage because of the shutdown of a pipeline. And that was done by hackers scaring a company into believing that their pipeline technology, their operational technology in the pipeline was vulnerable. We still don't know for sure whether it really was. It probably was. They certainly became convinced enough they shut down their own system. So basically, the hacker, got them this pipeline company to shoot itself in the foot, and that created a gas panic all up and down the southeast coast of the United States. So these incidents are very, very real and are becoming more visible to us every day. I'll hand back to Julian for some of the issues regarding sanctions, insurance, et cetera.
So let us add on to what Rick's just said, what we've been describing as a perfect storm. And this is cyber meeting sanctions. The Treasury Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence in the US have now made it clear that making of ransom payments could violate international sanctions. And indeed, that's especially in situations where that attack might be connected to geopolitical issues and state intervention, such as we've seen from Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And it's attacks such as the one that Rick's just mentioned that are leading legislators around the world to consider whether or not the payment of ransom should be made illegal. So you have this whole issue coming together of how we deal with not just cyber, but with sanctions. And then as more and more technology arrives in the maritime sector, then we're going to have to deal with issues such as autonomous vessels, autonomous malware, and even moving on to the concept of adversarial machine learning. So let's move on, and I want to hand back to Rick on this to look at operational technology and this question of whether cyber risk has found a back door. I want to ask Rick to talk about the difference between operational technology and information technology, and then talk about a concept that he has explained to me, which for me has put this really in context, which is the cyber house. Rick.
Thank you, Julian. Yes, there certainly are issues around the convergence of IT and OT that really has created a backdoor for hackers, or maybe in our analogy that you'll see here, maybe more appropriately, garage door for hackers. The basic understanding, we're all familiar with IT. We're using it right now. Laptops, servers, firewalls, all that. We deal with it every day. Operational technology, just to be clear, is technology that as an end result of controlling something in the physical world. world. So this goes down to on a vessel, the controls that it used to be a human, receiving a command and turning a valve or adjusting a control now are almost all done by what are called programmable logic controllers. PLCs is a term you may hear. And that has all become very automated, which is tremendous and efficient and everything. But also, as it's become more and more technologically capable, the OT has now become a viable target for hackers. And the thing we most need to think of when we think of IT and OT is to think of them together. Unfortunately, to the degree that we've seen some movement in the right direction, it's still been very isolated, looking at this particular threat or that particular threat. We really need to look at it holistically because the IT and the OT together provide numerous attack surfaces for the hacker to both enter into your system and then to have impact. So you really need to think of every level in the IT OT world as both a potential point of entry and a point of attack. Moving on to the next slide, we talk about our cyber house analogy. This is a very simple concept, but we've done a great job over the last 20 years or so of getting better and better at IT cybersecurity. Unfortunately, the hackers also are getting better at the same time, but we're doing a good job on that battle and doing almost everything we can. We've metaphorically put, deadbolts on the doors and bright porch lights so that, people can't sneak up on our house unobserved, and alarm systems and bars on the windows and all these wonderful things. And the hackers are getting more and more aware of that and recognizing, why am I going to stand here under your brightly lit porch light and try to pick your lock and defeat your alarm system when you've left the garage door open? And I'll simply go in through your OT, or I'll just attack your OT. There's all sorts of different approaches that they can take that enables them to do as much or more damage as they would have done directly to your IT by either coming in through your OT to get to your IT, or coming in through either your OT or IT to get to your operational technology. If they can control the ballast or the rudder or the engines or navigation on a vessel, they will really have you in a very difficult situation. So you really have to think of your entire cyber house, so to speak, as one entity that you need to protect. And you've done a great job probably on the IT side. It's time to really put a lot more focus into the operational technology. Moving on to the next slide. I mean, some of the simplicity of this, we often hear from people that, well, our vessel can't be hacked and everything. One of my favorite little stories on this was one of our people who you'll actually hear from in another session. One of our ethical hackers was about to get on a vessel off the coast of Brazil for one of our customers. And the captain was very adamant to him that, this vessel can't be hacked. None of our stuff is vulnerable. And so he decided to look at his watch as he stepped on board. And 23 minutes later, he had control of all the operational technology on the vessel and could have really done some awful things. Of course, the vessel was currently stationary. And, we do all these things very, very carefully during an ethical hack. But the example is true. And we've seen many, many more issues along those lines. I'll hand back over to Julian for discussions of the insurance issues and maybe opportunities. As is often said, that in almost any bad thing, there may also be an opportunity. There may be some positives we can try and take out of all this. I'll turn that back over to Julian.
So thanks for that, Rick. I think we're seeing that the bear that we started off with, our cyber bear, is both hungry and angry. And that cyber bear is also becoming hungry in a legal context. I'm going to fly over this in some very general detail rather than go into the intricacies of law. Probably those listening to this webinar that are aware of the duties of due diligence and seaworthiness in relation to the operation of vessels. And that's set out in Article 3, Rule 1 of the Hague Rules and the classic definition of seaworthiness. And the fact that an owner is only responsible for exercising due diligence over the asset whilst he's got control over it. So in the classic situation with an engine defect, if there's some kind of defect at the manufacturing stage, that's not going to fall within the ambit of the owner's control, so as to expose him to an argument that the vessel was unseaworthy. That's the decision in the Muncaster Castle. But what happens in a cyber situation? If there's been some kind of error in code during construction of the vessel, well, that probably is a Muncaster Castle type scenario, and a ship owner couldn't be blamed for failing to exercise due diligence or that the vessel was not seaworthy. But if there's a cyber attack, and the reason that that cyber attack penetrates the vessel's systems is because there's inadequate cyber defense upon the vessel, on board the vessel, then does that render the vessel unseaworthiness? Does that expose an owner to a risk that they have not exercised due diligence? Well, I think we will see cargo interests taking this argument in order to avoid contributions to general average, and indeed in seeking to defeat the owner's attempts to rely upon the defences which are set out in Article 4, Rule 2 of the Hague Rules. And it goes further than just seaworthiness. It goes to the whole concept of limitation of liability. Article 4 of the 1976 Convention of Limitation of Liability is the provision that sets out how to break limit. And traditionally, it's been very hard to break limit, especially for the 1976 Convention and the protocols that followed it, because the quid pro quo for increasing the limits was that it was harder to break liability. It was harder to break that right to limit liability. But Article 4 says that where there's been a personal act or omission with intent or recklessly, and with knowledge that such loss would result, you can break limitation. Now, I'm not looking at a personal act here, or even probably a personal omission. But what if there's been a reckless failure to have on board effective cyber defense in circumstances where you could argue that that knowledge must have been present due to the exposure and publicity in the market? Would that be sufficient to say that an owner had acted recklessly? Well, that's something that I've raised with a number of leading counsel in London, all of whom agree with me that that could well give rise to an argument of recklessness with knowledge, and that would allow you to break limitation due to the failure to have in place an adequate cyber defense system. So how can we conclude on this before we hand back to Simon? Well, cyber breach and cybercrime, we think, are the most significant risk facing shipping today and for the foreseeable future. We believe that the maritime industry needs to up its game, at least to the level of the aviation sector, so that it's no longer perceived as the soft target. And while some people are reporting fake news and Project Fear, we think that the industry needs to be alive to cyber threat and indeed the risk of maritime terrorism through cyber. And it's essential, we think, that the industry come together to introduce an adequate, effective audit system. And if I pose the Ghostbusters system, who you're going to call to sort this out? And we think that we've got the best solution under this Ince maritime cooperation between ourselves and Mission Secure. Now, we started off this presentation talking about an angry, hungry bear, and a strange reaction maybe from one of the two hikers that he went into his rucksack and extracted a pair of running shoes. Rick, perhaps you're going to tell us what the answer is.
Well, it might be surprising to hear from someone who represents a cybersecurity defense company, but there is no such thing as perfect cyber defense, and you do everything you can. The key is not to outrun the bear. It's to outrun the other hiker. You want to be the most unattractive target in your industry if you can. And hackers will inherently go after others, much easier targets. So that analogy holds pretty well for this industry. You get as close to perfect in defense as you can, but the key is to make sure that you're doing the most obvious, logical, immediate things you can do to not be the most attractive target to the bear.
Well, thank you very much, Julian, and thank you, Rick. That was fascinating, and I love the analogy of the cyber bear. I think that's a very interesting idea. And also, you mentioned about what the maritime industry can learn from aviation, and this is another very interesting point that we'll be touching on in one of the sessions tomorrow. So do look out for that. Julian, you did mention about Project Fear, and I think it's one of the interesting things about the maritime industry, of course, is that it's all about risk mitigation and risk management. What would you say to people who talk about cybersecurity and say that it is about Project Fear and really it's being overblown?
I would say that I think the totally and utterly wrong about that. Just looking back at those statistics, the increase in the percentage of attacks that we're seeing growing, the activity of hackers and cyber attack across other spheres. And Rick earlier spoke about the one that has just taken place only this week. And again, when recording this webinar, there's just been another attack on the Irish health system. Cyber is more and more becoming an issue for our sector. And when you look at the amount of disruption and loss that could be suffered as a result of a cyber attack, I really don't believe that it's something that can be ignored anymore. It's almost a sweet spot for me for a hacker in relation to maritime, because despite what is your motivation as a hacker, whether you're geopolitical, whether you're a hacktivist, whether you're a script kiddie, just seeing whether or not you can infiltrate a system, you tick all the boxes when you think that you potentially take over a vessel, disrupt a vessel, disrupt an entire global supply chain. For me, it's not Project Fear at all. It's a real significant risk.
And what about the aspect of the margins, which are so tight, or have been so tight in the maritime world? There are significant spends to be had. There's a lot of protection that's required from a cyber point of view.
I think one of the problems that we face, or an industry faces in relation to this question of the feasibility from a cost perspective of deploying cyber defense, is that people are not comparing like with like. There are very few systems out there which do actually create live defense, especially for operational technology. So what people are looking at is they're looking at IT solutions and trying to expand and deploy them into an OT field, and that can be very expensive because you're not deploying the right kit to address the right issue. We think that we've come up with a system that addresses that operational cost issue. We've spoken to a number of ship managers about that, and they've agreed with us that what can be provided at a realistic cost. Rick, do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Julian. I think one of the interesting things we find in looking at the maritime industry as compared to some of the other fields we work in, like defense and traffic systems and things like that, government systems, is that it's actually quite easy to quantify the risk. When people look at the cost of a vessel being out for a single day will probably, the cost of a vessel being down for the day would equal the cost of protecting 10 or 20 vessels for the year. And that, when you do the math on that, it really becomes, any new cost is hard to absorb. But when you look at it that way, I think a lot of people are realizing that this is a very small incremental cost to protect against an extremely large risk.
It's a great point. I think it was the late, great John Angelo Kousis who said, if you think safety is expensive, try an accident. Yeah, it's got to be the same with cyber, hasn't it? But Rick, where should the customers, where should their primary focus be? I mean, we've got IMO that's come in. Is this an issue for them just of compliance to IMO and to other regulations? What's their aim and ambition here?
Well, I always have to be careful when I say this phrase I'm about to say. I am hugely supportive of compliance. IMO, particularly, is a great idea. It's an excellent move for the industry to take steps in that direction. We're fully supportive of that. I sometimes use the phrase when giving speeches that compliance is not security. And I immediately have to follow that up quickly with, it's a very important and valuable step on the way to security. Inherently, any sort of compliance guidelines, regulations are a compromise. They're usually several years out of date. That doesn't mean they're not valuable. It's an excellent move in the right direction. But they were formed by a committee and they were agreed on probably a few years ago. And this is a fast-moving field. We strongly urge that customers adopt whatever appropriate compliance in their field, in this case, IMO. And part of our whole approach is to help them do that. But we also strongly urge them to not stop there. You really want to go beyond core compliance in order to be truly cyber secure. So we sort of see it as a step on the continuum, and we urge it, but we also urge that you really look at it not just from a check the box point of view. You want to go beyond it and really feel confident. We find that as we work with customers, as we work with them towards compliance, they start to really understand where the compliance gets them, and then the fact that especially some aspects of it, they really need to go further.
And although technology is not new in shipping. In the maritime world, technological systems have been around for a long time. If unseaworthiness and due diligence have become such a key issue, why haven't we seen a raft of these claims up to now or before?
That's a great question, Simon, and I think I've heard this from other operators and owners, and I think the answer is that in a way, we have seen this ever since there's been any kind of technology on vessels. All the cases that challenge lack of due diligence or challenge seaworthiness are about some kind of technical aspect of a vessel. It could be the hatch covers, it could be the engines, it could be the refrigeration plants. It's always been there. It's just that what we have now is two things happening at once: the speed of technology on vessels and the fact that vessels are more open to cyber attack because of the connectivity issues, where everything is speaking to everything. Well, one thing that Rick taught me very early when I started working with Mission Secure was you talk to operators and say, look, we have a complete air gap system between our IT and our OT. So, Julie, it's all very interesting what you're telling me, but, nobody can attack our operational technology at sea. Well, what Rick will tell you is that in 12 years of operation at Mission Secure, they have never found a truly air-gapped system. In fact, almost in virtually every situation, everything's talking to everything. So what I perceive we will start to see, and I think it's a real issue, is that as the knowledge base increases, both on the side of those that are using cyber as a weapon, and the knowledge then increases in relation to the way that you defend against those attacks, that's where you will see, I regret to say, lawyers acting for cargo interests, seeing this as a new weapon to deploy in order to defeat owners' defenses. And it's right, nobody has yet had or run a limitation, an attempt to break limitation by saying somebody failed to have a cyber system on board. But when you compare the cases where limitation has been broken and there's been a failure of an owner to do something that was available in the market, whether that's training of a seafarer or whether it's a navigational system update, then to me, it's just an accident waiting to happen. That somebody's going to hack a vessel, that vessel is going to ground or it's going to collide. And the lawyer will argue, if you'd had this defense system available, which is available on the market, that incident wouldn't have taken place. That's reckless.
Well, I think we're running out of time, but I think there is one more question that I'd like to get in, and it's probably for you, Rick, and it's really, what would you advise? What are the first steps that people should be taking from this point?
Well, someone's first steps obviously have to take into account where they are to begin with. But we find that most folks in the maritime world are still very early in what we call their OT cybersecurity journey. They've probably done a good job on the IT side, and that should continue. This isn't IT versus OT, but they probably haven't done very much on the OT side in our experience. Certainly, assessments are great, and we're always happy to help customers with that. But we want to help them move as quickly as possible to defense. So we try to actually combine things together into a package that enables them to, first of all, address IMO. And we even have an IMO readiness program that we will do with customers or prospective customers at no cost, where we'll walk them through a questionnaire that'll give them a scorecard of where they stand against various standards like NIST, BINCO, et cetera. And that's part of the IMO framework. So they can really understand better. And a lot of people we meet, they just don't know where to start. That's a great place to start because no cost. It costs them about 45 minutes of their time and to do the questions, and another half hour to 45 minutes to, for us to show them the results about a week later. That's a great place to start. If they're ready to move into assessments, great. But we want to move them as quickly as possible into actual defense. And that's one of the reasons why in our assessments, we actually use our defensive platform. So that during the time that we're assessing, we're actually seeing their capabilities and risks from the inside, and that can actually already start modeling a defensive platform for them as well, rather than just giving them an assessment report that they then have to start from scratch with. So that's the approach we take. There are obviously many different ways to approach this sort of thing, but our goal is to try to move them as quickly as possible into real world defense.
Well, Rick, thanks very much for that, and Julian, thank you also. It's been a fascinating session. This is such an important topic. It's such an important area for shipping, and there's a lot to do. So it only remains for me to say thank you both very, very much indeed, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We have a different session tomorrow. That'll be session 9. So please do join us for that. Thank you again.
Thanks, Sam.